Hello, this is John Spink. I'm the director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. This is our food fraud video series. Chapter 11 is on risk, and this is a review of one of our recent reports, Applying Enterprise Risk Management to Food Fraud Prevention, with a case study example of a complex food fraud management system. First off, the Food Fraud video series is a collection of short overviews of topics or reviews of scholarly reports. And there's related content on the internet, such as on YouTube or on our website. A basic overview of risk management and enterprise risk management is at this first YouTube link. This is a review of our recent Food Fraud Initiative report. And what we're doing here is we're going beyond explaining what is enterprise risk management to looking at applications. And we'll look at a couple key concepts. One is the application of ERM with specifically risk versus vulnerability. There's many risk assessments, and risk is a term that's used frequently, but when we get to talking about enterprise-wide risks, especially operational risks such as product fraud or counterfeiting, where there's a low number of incidents and low experience with it, and where the goal is to prevent rather than mitigate, then there's really an efficiency of using the terms and concept of vulnerability versus risk. Second, ROI versus vulnerability. ROI is used very typically to compare projects or to look at a specific project. And the key is that the specific project or comparisons. What we'll see is that when an ROI project is compared to all other potential ROI projects, many times this type of operational risk is very low in the priority. And finally, a case study of a complex food fraud management system. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that this paper was supported by Kerry's Global Supply Quality Teams program, and they helped us with the case studies and vendor management requirements. For more information on the Kerry group, you can see the link here. Why worry about ERM? The key is full systems compliance. We find many times that people are looking at one attribute, one aspect, one type of risk in and of itself. And there's this belief or understanding that someone else is going to compare the risks. That's real challenging because if we hand this upwards to, say, a finance person, they might not have any experience in food safety. So these are things that we need to communicate in the enterprise risk system. But full system compliance is the goal. Some groups are focused on FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, or Preventive Controls Rule, and we look closely at what is required and what's not required. And the key is overall FSMA and U.S. food laws, including the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, they require you to look at all hazards. So really the summary is that any agent, anything, that's anything, stolen goods, counterfeits, adulterant substances, theft, tampering, any agent that leads to a hazard that requires a preventive control, including from an act that is economically motivated. This is the scope of FSMA. What we say is that FSMA doesn't require you to do anything, but it holds you accountable for everything. How do you define a hazard that does not require preventive control? This is where enterprise risk management becomes a tool that's very effective. We can apply the same concepts when we look at economic risks to the health hazards as well. And we look at that threshold of what is acceptable and not. The Global Food Safety Initiative. And really, people aren't compliant to GFSI, they're compliant to the standards that are compliant to GFSI, such as BRC, FSSC, SQF, and others. The GFSI scope is clear and explicit. It covers all fraud and all products. And then it requires a vulnerability assessment and a prevention plan. And if we're really looking at full compliance across the company, the goal is to stay in business, be legal. So Sarbanes-Oxley or Sarbox is another key requirement. It's required by law for public companies, but really private companies, they have an enterprise-wide system as well. It might not be full ERM or very formal, but bottom line, if someone's investing in your business, they will be holding you accountable and they will monitor to make sure that their investment is being managed in a way that they direct. And Sarbanes-Oxley, the financial reporting, is one of those. Specifically, Sarbanes-Oxley is where enterprise risk management came from. It was developed by the COSO group to specifically address and be recognized by Sarbanes-Oxley. And the key here, you need to manage or disclose all threats to the revenue. And it's managed saying that the risks or vulnerabilities are within an acceptable threshold or they're reported. And basically, nobody likes to report that your business is very risky or that there are some risks or vulnerabilities out of control. So this is why enterprise risk management is such a strong method and process to use. First off, we'll look at the types of ERM risks. So this is a typical corporate risk map or risk map. And here we've shown a range of vulnerabilities that are plotted. And there's a theoretical line above which it's unacceptable, below which is within the risk tolerance or the risk threshold. There's really a middle ground there, the yellow zone, which is actively monitor. But what we see is most times companies, when they haven't done a lot of the vulnerability assessment, they see these risks across the spectrum. So when we do apply some of these into ERM, we show those components that are in that red zone. The optimal role, the optimal management of these risks is to have them all within the tolerance. And a key also, not just within the tolerance, but in this case, there were some activities that were even more conservative than the overall corporation's risk appetite. So really to optimize the financial return, there needs to be risk taking, and there needs to be risk taking that's defined with a method and a process. So in this case, some of these risks were too high and they needed to be managed or mitigated lower. And other risks actually it was a place where the company was too risk averse. Now, it's one thing if those risks cost a lot of money to implement or not, but this is the optimal role, is to have these risks just below the threshold. Inefficiency of ROI. This has been a real key topic for us because we've been really looking at how decisions are made within companies. And of course, every expenditure is intended to provide a value to the business and a return, if you will, but addressing operations or risk is not a typical earnings-focused return on investment or ROI. We go into great detail in the appendix. A key is that the board and the C-suite and the VPs are looking at revenue growth, top-line growth. That's what really gets attention. Reducing the loss of sales is important as well, but it's just not got the same attention getting that spending on the top line is. So a key here is that when we look at those ROIs, it's not really a typical ROI because it's not an increase in sales directly. It's a reduction in the loss of sales. A key for food fraud resource allocation decision making is that the operational cost will be compared to other proposals that may directly increase sales or corporate earnings. So the example we use is hire 2 sales reps. That if you're dealing with a plant that has excess capacity in a market that is short on product, then you can clearly identify this as direct increase of sales. And the goal would be to have a lot of increase in sales. And that kind of throughput really shows the business growing. It's also very ratable. And that's a real key, is to look at with this investment, how soon will you get a return? How sure are you of the return? And how measurable is the return? A second example we use is a piece of equipment that leaks $10,000 worth of hydraulic oil every year. You can spend money to reduce that loss, and you're very sure that you will receive that, but that's not something that's very exciting to put in a quarterly review to the analysts. The reduction of a cost is a return, but it's not directly an increase in earnings, and that's a real key here. We'll go into more detail. ROI scenarios. So what's better, an ROI of 2.33, 0.5, or unknown? This is the bottom line. We're not talking about hazards. We're not talking about costs. We're not talking about vulnerabilities, risks, or anything. This is the bottom line when there's decision making. Financial managers are making decisions. We need to communicate to them in their terms. Looking at this, 2.33 would happen. Now, if the company is in a cash-rich position, 0.5 would be okay. So it's a return over 2 years. You're going to be better off in the long run. But if cash is tight, that's not going to be a decision that's made. An unknown, well, how do you make a decision on what's unknown? Increase in sales, reduction of a cost, or reduce a possible loss. And that's the real key. When we are understanding how one decision is compared to another, this is the bottom line. This is the bottom line for the decision makers. So the key is we need to help frame it so that they realize that unknown, addressing the unknown or to reduce a possible loss, is a very wise, important, and critical investment. We'll get to that. So first off, this scenario 1 is adding 2 new sales reps. And it's to a new product in a market that's got 25% annual growth rate. So we've got a market that's growing, company has capacity. Direct increase in earnings, yes or no? It's a bottom line question, yes or no? Yes, it increases earnings. That's exciting. Again, that's something that goes in the quarterly report to the analysts. Confidence in realized value. So how sure are they that they could grow? Well, if they hire decent sales reps, which if there's decent sales managers in a history, then the confidence would be very high that you invest here and it would come back. The payback's actually less than 1 year. So you really have this great opportunity. Now, we said ROI at 12 months because the sales reps may have to warm up a little bit, but bottom line, you're looking at a return. And also, those sales reps will continue to sell and continue to accelerate their sales in the future. The second scenario is fixing a manufacturing equipment leak. So let's say the equipment's leaking $10,000 worth of product a year, and it costs $20,000 to fix. Direct increase in earnings, yes or no? No, because this is not a direct increase in earnings. It's an indirect increase in earnings. It reduces the actual costs that go into the business, so that does help profitability. But again, it's not a direct increase in earnings. Confidence in realized value, very high, because if you just fix this and you could measure it by looking under the equipment and seeing if it's leaking anymore. Key is a payback period in 2 years, and ROI at 12 months is 0.5. So this is still a very good project because it's even though it's not got a direct increase in earnings, it does have a high confidence and it does have a payback period that's clear and has those measurements that are clear. Again, the key is that if a company has the cash, then they can invest in this and reduce their costs in the long run. Third scenario, not legally mandated species authentication tests on incoming raw materials. So this is reducing a vulnerability. This is looking at a risk of a recall because of food fraud occurring. Direct increase in earnings, yes or no? No, it's not a direct increase in earnings. It reduces the possibility of a loss. So this is one step removed, one step less clear, less confidence in the return than even fixing the manufacturing leak. The confidence in the realized value is low. It's hard for us to judge this. The payback period is undefined because we don't have the confidence in the realized value or if we're really going to actually avoid a cost. And then so the ROI is unknown. And that's the bottom line here. So what we'll do, though, is enterprise risk management provides us with a way to look at vulnerabilities and the acceptable level of that risk threshold in a company. And if we can show that this vulnerability is in an unacceptable range, then it doesn't matter the ROI compared to everything else. The key is we're looking at this vulnerability and managing a vulnerability. Then we make decisions only on mitigating that vulnerability, but that's a real key point here. Application to shifting vulnerabilities. So we're going to show you 3 scenarios. One is, and this is a classic, so if you're a food safety group or operations group, brand protection, this is a real key application. Reduce food fraud prevention budget by $1 million. So how many times do you have to justify your business? And when you're dealing with this ROI challenge, so the sales manager's asking to take $1 million from you to hire sales reps. How do you defend that? How do you even justify or for yourself understand what is the optimal amount of resource allocation for your group? From C to D will be a lot less of action 1. So this is something where there's some testing or some countermeasure in place, a lot less. And E to F will be more of a certain type of test or certain activity. So right now, we don't have a way to judge whether this is good or not. I mean, you think generally reducing a budget by $1 million is bad, but how do we know? A lot less of action 1, that sounds really bad, but how do we know? And more of test 3, well, that would seem to be good without any other frame of reference. If we look at enterprise risk management in this corporate risk map, you'll see on the right, let's first look at A to B. So if you start in the green zone and go to the red zone, that is not only bad, that is unacceptable. That would raise the risk above the risk threshold, the risk tolerance of the enterprise. That cannot happen. So if A to B is a reduction in 1 million, then the question gets to be, how did you define that vulnerability and point B? But bottom line, you're showing them that your initial assessment is that it moves to the unacceptable zone. Now, at this point, it looks like it's about halfway there. So maybe it's reduced the budget by $500,000 is the discussion. But you know what? You've already achieved something. You're not talking about the million. You're now debating about the $500,000. Now, in this case, you also might start to discuss how did you come to the conclusion of point B, but that's excellent because that leads to more understanding of how the financial resource allocation decision makers are making decisions, and you will be able to more clearly define these vulnerabilities. And let's look at C to D. So C, a lot less of action one. So that sounds bad, but if you look here, that it just increases the risk, but still within the risk tolerance. So with this type of analysis, we should look at the same type of questions of what is the vulnerability, how did you define it? But bottom line is that risk treatment of reducing action one still keeps the business within the risk tolerance. Now, you might have a question of if that costs $100 to reduce that action, that's not very much of an investment. But if that costs $1 million, then that's a pretty good decision. Finally, E to F, more of test 3. So we clearly see that we're already in a situation at point E where there's an unacceptable risk. The vulnerability is unacceptable and it's above the risk tolerance. So if we look at test 3, it gets us down to point F, which is now down into the green zone. Now, a question might here is how much of test 3 do you need to do? Doing this full to point F might be too far. But again, the thing that's excellent is you now start to have discussions about that vulnerability and understanding how this enterprise risk is being assessed. Define the value of prevention, not in ROI, but in controlling the vulnerability. And this is a real key. This is something that's been very efficient. Assess projects for only A to B. So in this case, it's looking at these to really look at what you need to do in that situation. Now we'll go into the case study of the Kerry Global Supply Quality Program. And this is one that we've seen and we've worked with, and it demonstrates a lot of things. First off, the system itself, in the center is a food safety risk and vulnerability management system. And there's two parts of it. They've coordinated and integrated supply quality business processes with supplier quality governance review. The key is that you've got these different functions that are working together. They're interacting together to help to manage the business and control it within the risk tolerance. It's a system that connects everything to everything, and that's something you hear from us. When we're making decisions and looking at vulnerabilities, this is a real key concept. The risk assessments, audits, insights, which they call horizon scanning, concerns and warnings are integrated into an automated and linked information management system. It's all integrated. There's no manual approvals along the way. So if there's an unacceptable level at one part of the system, the entire network will be alerted. And maybe that stays within the risk tolerance, but sometimes it doesn't. And so there's an automation to the system. The activities are linked with the SAP information technology platform architecture. So people might not have technically enterprise risk management or ERM implemented. In this case, they have an SAP software information technology system. So they've got the decisions in there and the approvals and the thresholds that allow decisions to be made and the risk to be managed and controlled. Training programs in e-learning academy. They've got systems in place set up, training required for new people to even get in to manage the system. So they've got oversight, and then they have a way for lessons learned and best practices to be shared. So here's a look at the system itself for Kerry. And what we'll do is we'll first look on the left side and then look at the right side. We mentioned the two major areas, and one is supply quality business processes. So these are activities that are going on in the business. So you'll see there's the bottom right is supplier verification. So onboarding new suppliers. Information management is the way things flow around. New vendor setup. So that's different than supplier verification. That's new vendors, but it should be tied to supplier verification, such as if an auditor goes to a plant and finds a problem, then the entire system should be notified. And you'll see up there in the cycle audit request. So either a new vendor, something different in the system, something that information management shows up, a concern there, or the supplier verification, it could trigger an audit request. All of this goes through the central system that's the risk and vulnerability management. This is where that decision-making and calibration comes into play. Now, on the right side, we've got supply quality governance review. So these are more activities that are separate from the actual company or business. And you're looking at things like horizon scanning. That's looking at changes in market prices, maybe incidents out there. Specifically, food fraud is a separate task. And this is, I think, a real key within the supply quality risk and vulnerability management governance system, is that food fraud is different than any other risk. And at this point, we probably should be looking at it separately. Now, it doesn't have to be a big function, but it should be a separate function. You also see here this raw material nonconformance, so it's checking for raw materials and looking at these audit trends. So you've got this type of governance going on, and you'll see that integrates right into, let's say, connects everything to everything through that risk and vulnerability management system in the middle. So this is something we've seen as a best practice where all the job functions have been linked together and linked together within an information technology system so that they talk to each other, they can communicate. And with this, it enables things like data mining, and to be able to go in and look at different types of issues and looking for vulnerabilities. Conclusion. Food fraud requires a fundamentally different approach than for other business risks. Not just other food risks, but business risks. Right now, food fraud is new. And so if we try to apply a previous type of assessment, then it will be an ill-fitting tool, at least at this point. So we really should look at it separately. Again, that does not mean that it's a big or separate function, but we really just should look at this vulnerability separately. An enterprise-wide focus on vulnerability prevention is the most efficient action. So a key here is as we showed with ROI and other things, we're looking at vulnerabilities, and to put that vulnerability, especially now when it's new, and there's really no regulations on how much is enough, then it's really important to put it into the enterprise-wide system. And we've seen companies more and more where the second time we've interacted with them, they now have food fraud as an enterprise-wide, enterprise level, C-level item. Be aware of the resource allocation decision-making such as ROI. This is real key to think about how projects are proposed and how decisions are made. And so it's maybe a new concept to look at this, but consider the ROI separate from the normal systems of decision making. Take the time to construct a complex information management system. So do take the time. There's value here to having this connection. And if you think about any type of communication breakdown or anything that's manual, that's where we see some problems occur. And I've had a first boss say you can control 85% of your life and 85% of your work. So work very hard to do that, but continue to look at the 15 and try to reduce that part that's out of control. Getting these systems to talk to each other is a best practice to help reduce the uncertainties. Finally, just like to say we have a lot of activities at Michigan State. Please connect with us. We have a lot of resources between the massive open online courses that are free to executive education or graduate courses. We are at your service. With that, I will say thank you and have a great day.